Okay guys, so this video is going to look at the poem Outside History by Eavan Boland. So to start off, I want you to think about the term outside of history. What do you think this might refer to? And could you create a list of things that you yourself might consider to be outside of history, so things that do not exist within history? So objectives today, as always, to analyse the language of the poem and examine the structural features of the poem in detail. We also want to look at some of the social context which in social critique coming across through this poem. Now, if we look at a list of things that might be outside history, often people will come up with issues that come before history. So those of you who are quite into the study of history will know that history is to do with the written word and everything that's been recorded and written. Things that come before writing are generally considered to be prehistory. So yes, you are right in saying that they would be considered to be outside history. You also might think that the present and the future might be outside of history, but that's not really what's going on here. Okay, we're going to talk about this a bit more. Boland is looking at a different concept of what history actually is all about and the actuality of history. Okay, so what she's saying here is that throughout the 20th century there have been many different discussions about what history is. Okay, so the basic definition of history is defined as the events of the past since the time in which writing began. Okay, so history is everything that's happened since people started writing. Anything before that is known as prehistory, as there is no written account of what happened there. However, not everything that happens gets recorded. And not everything since we started writing, humans have not written down absolutely everything that happens. And for centuries and centuries, up until very, very recently, things that are written down primarily were to do with fairly wealthy or later middle class white literate men. That is what was written down more than anything else. And when we think about that, if you think back over what you would have learned in history, looking back at the time of the explorers, looking back at the time around Shakespeare, okay, looking back to before that in early Christian Ireland, you would have studied looking even at the Romans. Now Romans, it's a different era. There's all different eras, there's all different historical eras, but we'll see over and over again that the stories we hear tend to be about, nearly always about men. And we do have obviously exceptions of women in huge amount of who became incredibly powerful. You know, people like Cleopatra in ancient Egypt. You might look at Queen Elizabeth in the first in Britain around the time of Shakespeare, Queen Isabella of Spain. There are definite exceptions, but by and large, the vast majority of what we hear about tend to be white literate men. Okay, these were the people who were writing history, and this is what history recorded. Okay, but what about everybody else? Right? There's millions and millions of other people who were not written into these histories. So these people who live outside of the world where history was written down could be considered to be outside history. History never recorded their stories. An example would be women, especially, you know, as we've already pointed out, often had to accomplish so much more in order to be recognised in history. So the feminist movement, you will hear the term her story around, and this is trying to highlight the aspect of the male-dominated voice of history, okay, and trying to bring a bit more equality into our study of history. Okay, and there's a number of other groups which you might consider to be outside history, people of different racial backgrounds, people from certain countries where the country may have been more hit by poverty more. The history of Africa is, you know, generally much more difficult to, definitely it's not quite as well recorded. Generally, you know, the history of Europe is incredibly well recorded. Okay, but other areas, or the history of European men is incredibly well recorded, but other areas just aren't recorded in the same way. Okay, and these can all be considered to be outside history. So that is really what Boland is looking at in this poem. So if we get into the poem itself straight away, outside history. There are outsiders, always. These stars, these iron inklings of an Irish January, whose light happened thousands of years before our pain did. They have always been outside history. They keep their distance. Under them remains a place where you found you were human, and a landscape in which you know you are mortal, and a time to choose between them. I have chosen. Out of myth and history I move to be part of that ordeal, whose darkness is only now reaching me from those fields, those rivers, those roads clotted as firmaments with the dead. How slowly they die, as we kneel beside them, whisper in their ear, and we are too late. We are always too late. Okay, so looking at initial impressions, what comparisons has the poet drawn throughout this poem? Do you think this is an apt metaphor? And what might you describe the tone? How might you describe the tone of the poem? Okay, so if we look back at this poem now, this is another one of these poems where there's not a huge amount of description. The words are quite, condensed. It's not a particularly long poem to read, but there's so much in there, and it's almost more, it's a challenge to make sure you're getting everything out of there. Okay, so really take a few minutes, read through this poem a few times. Don't assume after one reading you're going to understand everything in it. You're going to need to read it 3 or 4 times and think about those questions. So pause it here for 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, so if we look at those questions again, what comparisons has the poet drawn throughout this poem, and do you think this is an apt metaphor? Okay, so one of the comparisons we can see is the issue of stars. So these stars we see in the first line, these iron inklings, okay, and we see the stars be referred to throughout. They keep their distance under them. This is under the stars that people live their lives. Okay, their light happened thousands of years before. We know that the light that reaches us from the stars can be very, very old, from very far in the past. And these stars could perhaps be a metaphor for the characters of history and the actions of people in the past. Okay, so we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a few minutes. But definitely we see the idea of the stars shining through the entire poem. It keeps coming up. Right? We also want to look at how to describe the tone of the poem. Okay, there is, the tone of the poem is a bit more difficult. There is definitely a respect for the past, okay, but there is a sense of, how would you say, a sense of, I'm trying to think of the word, a sense of ambition, maybe, probably not the right word, but a sense of ambition, wanting to achieve and change history and make a difference. Okay, so we'll look at the poem in a bit more detail now in a minute. Right, so the first 2 stanzas. There are outsiders always, these stars, these iron inklings of an Irish January, whose light happened thousands of years before our pain did. They have always been outside history. So, can you make 3 points about the use of structure in these 2 stanzas? Okay, so really examine this, okay, and explain the reasons for why you think the poet has chosen to use the image of stars. There are multiple reasons why the stars may have been chosen. So let's just pause here for 2 minutes and think about these 2 stanzas in detail. Okay, so if we look at these 2 stanzas, the first thing you might notice in terms of structure is the word always. So it's the surah around always. There are outsiders, always. She is very much showing us or telling us this is an aspect of history. It's not a single complaint. This is something that needs to be considered across cultures and across different areas of history. These stars, then the dash after that, again creating a pause. She's bringing us into and making us think about the way we look at the past. And she's using the idea and the science of the stars, and the stars have always been something humans have connected with. So we know the science of it, that it takes thousands of years for some light from some stars to reach us. We might also be aware of the constellations and the Greek mythology of the stars, and indeed mythology from throughout a number of cultures about the stars. The stars have always been an aspect of human discovery. We notice that there is enjambment between the lines also, so this could be important in terms of breaking up we could look at the continuity of history, or we could look at the lack of structure and the lack of a fulfilled and controlled history. So there's quite a few things we can do here in terms of the structure. Okay, you might also want to look at those. They've always been outside history, that removal of the outside history from the rest of the lines of that second tercet. Okay, really highlighting the issue. Some of the reasons we might think of the stars, there's a number of reasons for this. We know that the stars, are ever present, as I've already said. We can look at the idea of what stars, stars are as something that people aspire to be. in the world. Okay, a number of issues, or a number of different interpretations for those stars. So if we start and look at some of the annotations for this, first thing you want to see is down the blue box, so we're going a bit backwards here. The image of the star could represent hope or power. However, Boland is also drawing on the idea of the star existing at a distance, and the light we see is from the past. A division in the world, which has been occurring for a long time, iron could be reminiscent of a prison separating and caging a group. Okay, so the iron inklings, the stars, iron inklings, yes, they are beautiful from the past, but do they represent an idea that holds people back and cages people in? The issue of those outside of history are ever present, thousands of years before. It's an ever present aspect of history, and there's a clear connection between the present and between the present moment and history to exist together. Our pain, so their light still shines coming from well before our pain, but they've always been and they still are here now. If we move on to the next two stanzas, they keep their distance. Under them remains a place where you found you were human, and a landscape in which you know you are mortal, and a time to choose between them. I have chosen. What concepts does the poet begin to engage with in these stanzas? There could be multiple interpretations for the stars in these stanzas. What interpretations can you describe? And what is suggested by the final line in this second stanza, so stanza 4 here. So again, I'm going to say pause here for 2 minutes and really think about those questions and these two stanzas. Okay, so the concepts that are starting to come up here, she brings in humanity into this, directly into the poem here, and she brings in the idea of the mortality of humans. Okay, so that we are mortal, we will someday be part of history, and that are we going to aspire to be those stars, or are we going to stay in the place where we are humans? Okay, when she says she has chosen, there's an ambiguity about what she is choosing here. Perhaps she is choosing between being a human and being a star. Okay, there could be multiple interpretations of the stars here, as I've already said. Okay, they could be the stars of, shining bright people of history. They could be things in history that have a long, that affect things in a long, for extended periods of time. They could be looking at myths and legends, and that sometimes history, when it's recorded, is not recorded correctly. Okay, and the people are represented in a unrealistic way as stars rather than as humans. Okay, the final line suggests that she has made her decision, but it's not necessarily saying we all need to make the right decision, but it's clearly that the poet has decided for herself what she wants from life and how she wants to be remembered in history or outside of history. So a few little notes alongside here. There's a good deal of ambiguity as to whom Boland is speaking to. Is it people in general or a specific person that she is speaking to here in these lines? She emphasises the distance of the star, perhaps insinuating something about the nature of hopes or our rose-tinted views of the past. Okay, that maybe the view we see of the past, because it's been taken, because it's from so far back, is very much inaccurate in terms of what the history was actually like. Do we see the history as being much better in a much more nostalgic way than actually should be viewed? As mortal humans, we exist differently to the stars. Perhaps we need to forge hope closer to our own time period. Perhaps we need to move forward rather than looking into the past. So maybe she's saying, stop looking to these characters that we remembered in the past and look to the future, and where the people who've been outside of history maybe can come within history. And Boland ends up presenting us with a choice. The range of interpretations to what this choice is. However, the idea which stands out to me most is that we are being forced to choose between living a distant and detached existence like the stars, or living as mortal humans with a single life to make history during. Okay, are we going to live in the past and examine the history and not think about the current world, or are we going to really examine the current world and become part of that? Is that where our minds should be? Is she perhaps talking to people who are more activists and wanting to change history and saying stop focusing on what was gone on in the past and how things are recorded, and record differently for the future, that we affect the future, we don't really affect the past? Then moving on to the final three stanzas of the poem. Out of myth and history I move to be part of that ordeal, whose darkness is only now reaching me from those fields, those rivers, those roads clotted as firmaments with the dead. How slowly they die, as we kneel beside them, whisper in their ear, and we are too late, we are always too late. So what choice has the poet made in the final 3 stanzas? Why do you think the poet repeats we are always too late at the end of the poem? And what other language helps to build a sense of regret, perhaps, here in these stanzas? Okay, so what I would say is just pause here for a few minutes and really think about those lines of the poem. Okay, so the choice that she seems to be making here is that she is going to be part of the ordeal. She's going to be part of those who have suffered in order to maybe to bring about change. Okay, so there's a huge amount of ambiguity throughout this poem. It's definitely she is choosing to do something rather than simply to examine things. The darkness here seems to be, it's those things that have not been recorded. The darkness is not necessarily negative, and it's not just the absence of light, it is something else going on. It is a force within itself, and the darkness is those things that are outside of history, perhaps. Okay, so when she's talking I want to be part, she wants to continue the story of those who haven't been recorded, okay, and look at what they, and continue their work, okay, and continue to look forwards and bring that kind of forgotten aspects of history. So she may be thinking about maybe Irish history. We've talked about there's the Irish January was in the first stanza. Now she may be possibly she's talking about the roads. We've looked at the famine road. Perhaps she's bringing in some issues around those people, those Irish who were forgotten by history and left struggling. Okay, so is she bringing perhaps her nationality, an Irish nationality, to the forefront here, as well as the idea of feminism? Are they both coming in together? Right? Why do you think the poet repeats we are always too late? And this is the struggle of being outside of history. Okay, and we are always too late. We are always too late. So it's we. So it's in one way there's a consequence to the poet choosing to identify with a shared history. Okay, she's including the reader also. She's inviting us to be part of this ordeal as well. Okay, so there's quite a lot going on in terms of how she's asking us to engage with her history and join her in looking at those things that are outside history. Okay, there's a sense of regret how slowly they die, in that we may never be able to achieve what we wish to achieve, and the struggle that she has taken part in may never be. They may never overcome the struggle, but she still sees it as worthwhile being involved in. Okay, so if we look at some notes then along here, Boland wants to be part of the ordeal of history, suggesting she chooses to be an active and involved person. Firmament here, the word firmament in the end of the second stanza shown at the moment, refers to the heavens or the sky, especially when regarded as a tangible thing. Okay, so it's possibly linking in there with the stars as well. The darkness reaching her could be referenced to her coming to an understanding of how she, women, Irish people, immigrants, other oppressed peoples have been left out of history. So this darkness coming to her, she's reading their stories, she's finding those stories, but it's not an absence of light, it's just something that light hasn't really illuminated yet. It's still an active force. There's a direct link between the dead of the past and the stars she was referred to in the line firmaments with the dead, so she's connecting the stars, like I said, firmaments referring to the heavens and skies, she's connecting that with the dead, the people of the past. How slowly they die could refer to the myths and falsehoods of history, or could be a comment on grief and remembering the past. Okay, so it's quite an ambiguous poem. There's a lot that different interpretations we can take. So the slowly they die could refer to that there's a lot of falsehoods about the past. There's very much certain people put into positions of grandeur, and other people completely forgotten. And it will take a long time to overcome that. And she's not underestimating that challenge that's going to be faced. There could also be a comment on grief, that grief is a long-lasting thing, and it takes a long time to be able to really examine it. Too late may refer to that we take too long to amend our mistakes and amend history and look at the past and say what actually happened. Okay, but could also be a call to people to action, that we were always too late. Let's come on, let's go, let's get moving with this. Okay, so this is quite a conceptual poem, and it's a poem you need to spend a bit of time with to really get your head around. Okay, so I do suggest reading it a few more times and going through the notes here that we've gone through a few more times, breaking down into a few different interpretations, okay, and see, can you follow and find coherent voice within it, because there definitely is a wonderful message within the poem. It's just you may need to dig to really interpret it. So read it both for the language, also for the commentary within it. And the question to take away and really think about is, does outside history make a compelling case on behalf of voiceless and marginalised people?